What were my endo symptoms? This one's a doozy. I recently finished 5 egg retrievals and I'm currently in a Lupron Depot induced menopause in preparation for transfer. Before all of this came my endo diagnosis, which was in August of 2022. We found out I had endo at my first IVF appointment when I had my very first internal ultrasound, and we discovered that I had 4.5 centimeter endometrioma, which is a blood-filled ovarian cyst on my right ovary, and that's a telltale sign that you have endometriosis. I later had a laparoscopy to remove that endometrioma, along with a ton of endometriosis that was just scattered throughout my body, and I also had my appendix removed because it was just brimming with endometriosis. Before all of this, I did actually have endometriosis symptoms. I just didn't know they were endometriosis symptoms. Ever since I was 13, I've had the worst periods, like knocked on my butt, really bad cramps, really bad nausea, to the point where I would go to school and I would actually have teachers send me to the nurse's office telling me that I looked ill. Like, I would get pale. I felt so sick and so icky. And I just had really bad cramps, and that was like the first 1, 2, sometimes even 3 days of my period. It wasn't until I was like 18 that I discovered Midol and Midol PM, and that was able to give me some relief, but I still had really terrible periods, really terrible cramps, and like, I honestly would cancel plans the first day of my period because it was just so bad. I'd go to the gynecologist and tell them that I had really painful periods, and they just told me that that was super normal and everyone had painful periods. It literally drives me insane to know that that's one of the primary symptoms of endometriosis, and I had it this whole time. The other thing that drives me crazy is all it took to diagnose me with endometriosis was an internal ultrasound. Why do gynecologists not have internal ultrasounds? Why? Why do they just do a pap smear? Why? How hard is it to do an internal ultrasound? Like, all of us doing IVF, we know it's easy. Doctors do it every day, 100 times a day, probably more. Like, why are our gynecologists not doing this? I know most people with endometriosis can't be diagnosed with an endometrioma because most people don't have an endometrioma, and therefore the only way to be diagnosed is with a laparoscopy. But for all of us out there that do have endometrioma as an ovarian cyst, like, we can be diagnosed. Hope that answers your question, and hope you don't have endometriosis.